Thanks very much. My name is Gareth Atkins. I'm from Queen's College, Cambridge, and it's my great delight to be able to introduce the second keynote speaker, Professor Anthony G Reddie. Professor Reddie is Director of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture at Regent Park College in the University of Oxford, and an extraordinary Professor of Theological Ethics at the University of South Africa. In 2020, he received the Lanfranc Award for Education and Scholarship from the Archbishop of Canterbury for his exceptional and sustained contribution to black theology in Britain and beyond. Among his many books are Theologizing Brexit, A Liberationist and Post-Colonial Critique, 2019, and Is God Colourblind? Insights from Black Theology for Christian Faith and Ministry, republished in 2020. This afternoon, he is going to be speaking to us on Amazing Grace and Cheap Grace, Learning from the Cross and the Lynching Tree. Professor Reddie.
It's always interesting when people clap you before you even say a word. I hope that I can do duty to your applause. It's indeed a great honour to be here, and I thank the organisers of this event for inviting me to come and to share my thoughts. Amazing Grace and Cheap Grace, Learning from the Cross and the Lynching Tree. On these occasions, I always think it's important for the speaker to say something about themselves. The person with whom I am in dialogue today, that is James H. Coe, was always of the belief that all theology, all attempt to talk about God, is also a form of autobiography. That as we speak about God, that says as much about the person who's doing the speaking as it does about the God about whom we are trying to talk. I was born in Bradford, West Yorkshire, so although I lived for 37 years in Birmingham, I still have a strong Yorkshire accent. It's often said that you can take the man out of Yorkshire, but you cannot take Yorkshire out of the man. But more importantly, I speak as a descendant of enslaved Africans. My surname, Reddie, is an African name. Sorry, not an African name, sorry. Not an African name. It's actually a Scottish name. It comes from Persia. And so that speaks, therefore, to a relationship between white colonial British power and those of my ancestors who were enslaved on supposedly Christian plantations in the Caribbean. If I were to sum up this talk, it would essentially be this: that I'm not particularly interested in John Newton. I have no disagreement with him. But actually what I'm interested in are the countless enslaved Africans he shipped. That when we often think about Amazing Grace, we think about this individual who is named, who gives up his activities in the slave industry, repents, ends up in a place like here. So when I arrived here, I thought this is a very, very picture postcard, beautiful town. Not exactly a hardship, that's all. But what of the people he shipped? Unnamed, undocumented. They didn't get to write books. They didn't end up in places like here. So what is their redemption? And their descendants. In 1833, when slavery was finally abolished, the slave traders and the slave owners were compensated to the point of £20 million, 40% of the British exchequer, 40% of the gross domestic product. That was not paid until 2015. Their enslaved descendants didn't get a penny. So as a black liberation theologian, as I said, no disrespect to John Newton, I'm interested in the ones who we have forgotten, the ones who have disappeared in history. I'm interested in the legacy that has pursued people of African descent. Finds expression in their descendants being deported from this country, many of whom came on British passports and the invitation of the British state to do jobs that white people do not want to do. It's one of their descendants, George Floyd, who gets murdered, with a police officer standing on his neck for 8 minutes and 43 seconds. Where is his redemption? So in this paper, I want to juxtapose the costly grace exemplified by the salvific work of Jesus on the cross and the cheap grace that is the collective entity that is often put on white British Christianity. It's entangled with colonialism and empire, and the privileges of white bodies juxtaposed against the global majority heritage of the British Empire. I want to start my talk by reminding us of a key text. And for those of us who have grown up in church or still go to church or identify in some way as Christians, it's a text that we are very familiar with. But I want to suggest that our familiarity with it has hidden its inherent radicalism, but also a major contradiction for the development of what we would now call British Christianity over the last 500 years. This is John's account of Jesus standing before Pontius Pilate, as recorded in John chapter 18, verses 28 to 40. And I'm reading from the New American Standard Bible. Then they brought Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and he was early. They themselves did not enter the praetorium so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Therefore Pilate came out to them and asked, "What accusations are you making against this man?" They answered, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not be handing him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourself and judge him according to your laws." The Jews said to him, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death." This happened so that the words of Jesus, which he said, indicating what kind of death he was going to die, would be fulfilled. Therefore Pilate entered the praetorium again and summoned Jesus and said to him, "You are the king of the Jews." Jesus answered, "Are you saying this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate answered, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation, the chief priests, handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this realm. If my kingdom were of this realm, my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." Therefore Pilate said to him, "So you are the king?" Jesus answered, "You say correctly that I am the king. For this purpose I have been born, and for this I have come into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone who listens to my voice listens to truth." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" After saying this, he came out again to the Jews and said to them, "I find no grounds at all for charges against this man. However, you have a custom that I release one prisoner for you at this Passover time. Therefore, do you wish that I release to you the King of the Jews?" So they shouted again, "No, not him, not this man, but Barabbas." Barabbas was a rebel. Amen. I have read this story because it's an important means of interpreting church history and mission as it relates both particularly to black bodies under the aegis of enslavement and colonialism. Pontius Pilate is a Roman governor of an occupying imperial force. Jesus, on the other hand, is a subjugated, colonized Jew in Roman-occupied Judea. Enslaved Africans in the Caribbean and the Americas, my ancestors, they recognized that God was on the side of the oppressed and not on the side of the oppressors, as represented by Pontius Pilate. They saw Jesus' experience as analogous to their own, and not those of the slave masters who were oppressing them, or the colonial apparatus that supported the actions of the latter. In historical texts, like those written by Noah Erskine in a very fine book called Plantation Church, the author shows how an early experiential version of what we now understand as Black liberation theology was one that was expressed by enslaved Africans. And this created an important and essential epistemological break between the enormity of white-dominated views of Christianity and the radical Judeo-Christian tradition found in the scriptures. In the former, the central message of the Christian faith is sufficiently spiritualized so that there's no link between lived experience and the teachings of the church, which explains why many white Christians could enslave others, steal their land, or demonize their cultures and still think that they were fulfilling God's righteousness. And we heard a lot of that this morning in terms of Newton's own work, which was often untroubled by the fact that it was creating misery for others. But conversely, enslaved Africans were able to rethink the basis of the Christian faith, and to do so in order that they themselves in their oppressed condition could identify with ancient Israel in the first century and see in Jesus' own suffering something that was analogous to their own experience as enslaved people. And yet the colonial history of British churches, especially the Church of England, founded on the construct provided by missionary Christianity, was one in which whiteness, British exceptionalism, and notions of manifest destiny became all conjoined in order to provide a religion that became the handmaiden of empire. In the words of David Livingstone, famous British explorer and missionary in southern Africa in the second half of the 19th century, he himself said that the British Empire was founded on the 3 C's: commerce, civilization, and Christianity. Christianity, therefore, provides the philosophical and theological underpinning for the quest of expansionist greed and the fulfillment of what was called the white man's burden. And so the key intellectual challenge, however, lies in the disjunction between the British churches and the initial Jesus movement, the movement of Christianity founded on the life experiences and the crucifixion of a colonized, oppressed person. And so therefore, to read this text, as I did, that one is often tempted to imagine certain British historical churches like the Church of England and her smaller ecumenical partners, I speak as a faithful Methodist, that all these churches equate themselves with Jesus. After all, every Easter tide, we read this text, and the truth is that churches in Britain imagine themselves to be allied with Jesus. Yet Jesus was a colonized Jew in the midst of the British Empire. So here's the rub. Pontius Pilate represents whiteness. Not just in terms of his epidermis. I'm not saying that Pilate was a white man. But he was white in terms of the imperial power of the colonizers. His encounter with Jesus is because he alone has the power of life and death. In the text that I read earlier, he says to the Jewish people, "Why don't you execute him yourself?" And they say, "But we can't execute him because we have no power in our own country to do so." It's interesting that in many Caribbean countries, certainly where the Queen is still the head of state, if you want to execute someone, not that I'm in favour of execution, I would say, just saying that I'm a lean partner who does not believe in the death penalty. But if you do, you still have to send somebody to the Privy Council to get permission in order to do that in your own country. Because being part of the Commonwealth and having the Queen as the head of state still therefore means that the ultimate authority lies not within democratically elected governments in those countries, but still lies with the monarch, the Queen of England. So the truth is, in this encounter, which churches are not Jesus, we are Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate is the Roman governor who oversees a colonized state on behalf of the person who's sent in, that is Caesar. In many of the occupied countries of the world, the British Empire is the largest the world's ever seen. I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. Country 44,000 square miles in circumference. At its peak, owns and controls 24% of the world, just under a quarter of the world. And in many of those places, there were governor generals sent by the British Parliament under the authority of the Queen to rule and control those particular lands. Now, but when we look at the biblical text, we are being fooled into identifying with the wrong person. We identify Jesus because we think that we're the church and we are the inheritors of that tradition. But actually, we are, I say we, and we be blunt, white Christians, represent Pontius Pilate, empire. Counter to this is James Cone's magisterial book, The Prof and the Lynching. James Cone is the founder of Black Liberation Theology. He was born in 1938 in Bearden, Arkansas. And in 1969 he wrote the first systematic black theology text called Black Theology and Black Power. And from 1969 all the way through to death in 2018, he was the progenitor and in many respects, as far as I'm concerned, the greatest exponent of black liberation theology. Black liberation theology is the theology of enslaved and marginalized peoples. It's their attempt to see in Jesus the means of their freedom that critiques the blandishments of empire and colonialism that identifies really with Pontius Pilate. In his penultimate book, The Cross and the Lynching, published in 2011, Cone explores the relationship between the ritualized desecration of black bodies in the context of lynching and the desacralized view of the cross. See for what it is, a brutal example of state-sponsored terrorism, meted out to political dissidents by an all-powerful, all-conquering imperial power. But the cross wasn't just something that you meted out to any particular dissident or particular criminal. You did that particularly to those for whom you want to make an example. So Jesus' challenge both to Roman imperialism, but his challenge to the status quo, and his challenge to the Jewish authority, he is marked out as an enemy of the state. And so therefore the cross, that's one of the most brutal ways in which you can die. It takes about 3 days to die, of course. And most times how you die is through suffocation, your lungs collapsing on themselves. So the whole point of the cross is that you're not meant to die quickly or painlessly. It's the opposite. You're meant to die over 2 or 3 days in agony. And your body's left there as an example so that anyone else who has a clever idea of trying to oppose imperialism of Rome gets the same treatment. Yet, as Cone shows, most white people have managed to so spiritualize the cross that they see no relationship between the brutal realities of state-sanctioned persecution and the synonymous dismemberment of black bodies through the phenomenon of lynching. A God who sides with those who are oppressed and marginalized is one who speaks out against the vested interests of white bodies privileged by colonialism and empire. It is the greatest of all black theologians, Professor James H. Cone, who creates the most sustained and systematically articulated relationship between enslaved and oppressed peoples and the Jesus of history, who was executed at the hands of colonizers and imperialists. And so one of the key insights is this. He says, if Jesus was a colonized Jew living under the aegis of Roman occupation, and it's worth noting that this is hidden in plain sight, the whole of the New Testament is written against the backdrop of Roman imperialism. If Jesus was a colonized Jew in first century Galilee, then his risen identity as the Christ of faith has to be as an oppressed person, a black person living under the aegis of white supremacy in the 20th century. If God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and is consistent in the nature, in his nature, then the Jesus who discloses God's revelation as an oppressed Jew cannot be an entitled white person who represents empire in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. This is inconsistent with God's very nature. It is therefore interesting that once Christianity becomes ensnared with empire, post-Constantine, an imperial church now ensconced in the heart of empire no longer wants to identify the Romans as the villains, because that would indict themselves, i.e. other imperialists, as having to account for their own actions. And so British imperialism, occupying people's lands with as much ruthless efficiency as the Romans did, all of a sudden no longer sees the Romans as to blame, but now it's the fault of the Jews, which therefore leads to over 1,000 years of anti-Semitism. See, I grew up in Sunday school with my Sunday school teachers telling me that it was the Jews who killed our Lord. But actually, if you go back to the text I just read, unless I'm consistently stupid and did not understand what I just read, it seems to me that it was Pontius Pilate who convicted him to death. An imperialist. So therefore, let's be clear that this text reminds us that the Jews did not crucify Jesus, but the Romans did. And it is the presence of the Romans that's analogous to the presence of the British who colonized my ancestors in the Caribbean. It's the British who occupy and exploit approximately 24% of the world, the largest empire the world's ever seen. And it's worth noting that the creation of empire then gives rise to what we now see more benign term as a so-called commonwealth, which to me is just empire under another language. It's very interesting in the recent Platinum Jubilee celebration, which I have to confess as a Republican, probably won't go down that well here, but I did kind of lie down in a darkened room and pretend it did not exist. And that's what I'm trying to work up about 3 days later, like I'm Uncle Stiltskin, and assume that it never happened. Others are guilty of some type of false consciousness. But actually it's very interesting how the language of empire still ripples over into the language of colonialism. So it's interesting that as we speak within an Anglican church, that we're also thinking of an Anglican communion, a voluntary come together of churches worldwide with the head always in the so-called mother country of Canterbury. Throughout church history, this side of Chalcedon, which was the imperial conference called by Rome in order to determine the nature of Jesus. Think about it, it's the politics of Rome that decides what Jesus is like, not necessarily just the church. The church is now part of empire. See, it's why British Christians give credence to doctrines and church teachings on the one hand, and yet are unable to match such belief with any kind of praxis that sees Christ represented in those who are deemed the least of these. Matthew 21, 31 to 46. It's in this failure that saw many black Christians who travelled from the Caribbean to Britain on British passports, such as my parents who came in 1957, who were evangelized and whose formation took place under the aegis of British imperialism, but saw them invited to come to the country and yet rejected by the churches that had evangelized them in the first place. It's in the early iteration, therefore, of black theology that contrasts the development of the understanding of the people of God, namely Israel, who throughout the Hebrew scriptures, often commonly called the Old Testament, we see a covenant relationship with God. God's relationship is to an oppressed group of people of Israel, whom God has elected, and this provides the platform for God's revolutionary activity to demonstrate God's righteousness to the world. So the fulfillment of this process of God acting in history culminates in the work and the person called Jesus of Nazareth. And so with the coming of Jesus, the church comes into being to give practical expression to the teaching and the values shared by the activism, the message and the sacrificial death of Jesus, the one in whom and from whom the church takes her identity and authority. Cole says this about the church. The church then consists of people who have been seized by the Holy Spirit, who are determined to live as if everything depends on God. It has no will of its own, only God's will. It has no duty of its own, only God's duty. Its existence is grounded in God. End of quote. In this regard, it's important to know that Cole has a high view of the church. In making this remark, I do not mean to say that Cole sees the church in episcopal terms, in the use of the term high, that might constitute a way of denoting a church with a pronounced sense of hierarchy that conforms to the notion of apostolic succession, like the Church of England. Cole doesn't mean high in that sense. What Cole means to say is that he does not see the church in purely utilitarian terms, merely as a human institution that seeks to do some good. For Cole, the church is understood as a gift of God, created in order to undertake the work of liberation to which God has given expression in the witness and the supreme example of Jesus Christ. And so because of this divine calling, Cole expects much from, and is therefore scathing when the church fails to live up to its high calling. Of particular importance to James Cole is the differentiation between the white church of empire and the church that emerges from the belief and practices of the white Euro-American heritage of empire, and the black church, the church that comes into being from the lives of enslaved peoples. And the latter is the opposite of the former. So the black church historically, of which Mahalia Jackson was a classic example in her singing of Amazing Grace, and the way in which that has been taken up by black communities across the world. It grows out of the struggles of former enslaved peoples in order to give life to the liberative impulse of God they have witnessed in their lives in the power of the Holy Spirit. And basically it's this classic disjunction between the two different forms of Christianity that's helped to shape the development of black liberation theology, of which I'm a part. I love this quote from James Baldwin, who says, and I quote, "White people discovered the cross through the Bible, but black people discovered the Bible through the cross." That essentially the birth of Christianity amongst enslaved peoples in the diaspora did not come from an intellectual assent to a set of propositional truths detailed in the scriptures, but it came from the hard experience of being crucified, or the criminal crucifixion on plantations, in which in the midst of their struggle, they found the presence of Jesus Christ in their lives and the power of the Holy Spirit. And so for Cole and for many black theologians like myself, the authenticity of the church and Christianity is not found in its adherence to doctrines and dogma and creeds. Rather, it is through and to the extent to which it is willing to participate in the radical work of God revealed in Jesus Christ. It is to the extent to which the church is willing to make a difference in the world and to contradict the false teachings of white supremacy and the jaundice and bias operations of the status quo that upholds capitalistic greed and naked self-interest. When the church does that, then the church is created to be what it was meant to be. Yet, as Cole demonstrates throughout his work, the failure of the church of Christian theology, Christianity, to denounce white supremacy, white entitlement and privilege, is a damning indictment of the institutional white church. Central to the identity, therefore, of the church and its continued mission must be its clear sense of being a counter-cultural agency that challenges and refutes any notion of injustice and the habitual selfishness of the world. Take, for example, this long quote from James Cole. He says, and I quote, "The Christian church is that community of persons who got the hint, as they thus refuse to be content with human pain and suffering. To receive the power of God unto salvation, placing persons in a state of Christian existence, making it impossible for them to sit still as their neighbours are herded off to prison camps. The hint of the gospel moves them to say no to the rulers of the world. If our brothers and sisters have to go, then it will be over our dead bodies. They are the ones who believe in a gospel of liberation, convinced that personal freedom is more important than law and order. Because the church is a community that participates in Jesus' liberating work in history. It can never endorse law and order if that itself is a cause of suffering. And yet, across the world, we've seen the church collude with apartheid. We've seen the church collude with all forms of, the various forms of separation. We saw in the past the previous Pope that largely colluded with the state of Germany and its oppression of Jewish people. It's worth remembering in 2007 when we marked the bicentennial abolition of the slave trade, the then Prime Minister Tony Blair, I said this as a member of the Labour Party, well, tell a lie, I've joined the left on several occasions. And I'm not in it, I might be joining. We don't know. It's a kind of love-hate relationship. Well, actually, it's a hate relationship. But it's worth remembering in 2007, the then Prime Minister Tony Blair said that the British government could not apologise for slavery because it was legal at the time. Legal at the time. Legal through the dictates of white supremacy, not through the dictates of black suffering. But therefore, in terms of that long quote, one can quickly deduce from the quotation that much what happens on a Sunday morning in many parts of the world is not necessarily an authentic expression of the church. According to high expectations held in it by James Coe. For most churches, being church, and I say this on my own church, Methodist Church in Senegal, entails coming together, singing hymns, speak prayers, and have some form of liturgy, be it formalised, prescribed, or implicitly improvised. Listen to some form of address or sermon, often given by someone like me, and then have coffee tea afterwards and informal chit-chat, and then we all go home. The formation takes place, if we're honest, as a ghettoised experience, often separate from the world and the myriad problems and challenges that exist there. Now, of course, not every church is like that, and there are many notable exceptions. But in my limited experience, the latter are the exception and not the rule. Cohen's words, therefore, are an anathema to the millions of white evangelicals in the US who twice voted for Donald Trump and his populist brand of white Christian nationalism. The noted African-American black theologian Josiah Young himself says, a former student of Cohen, doctoral student of Cohen, he outlines the intellectual and faith gap between conservative white evangelicals who voted for Trump and the majority of black Christians who oppose his presidency but are still evangelicals. Citing the diametrically different ways in which both groups saw and interpreted the Christian faith in the public square, Young writes, and I quote, many white conservative evangelicals are the progeny of racist privilege, whilst many black evangelicals are the progeny of enslaved people. End of quote. And so the crucial difference between the foundational moments of white Christianity and black Christianity often provide the template and the backdrop against which Cohen is making his assessment on the authentic nature of the church and Christianity. I give the propensity, certainly in the US, of white Christians to stand back and support the lynching of African Americans and to see the continued involvement of black lives not natural, is to see the extent to which white Christians in America might be seen as anything but Christian. Cohen reflects on the fundamental difference between these two modes of faith when faith is seen through the lens of the church. He writes, and I quote, the cross has been transformed into a harmless, non-offensive ornament that Christians wear around their necks. Rather than reminding them of the cost of discipleship, it has become a form of cheap grace. An easy way to salvation that doesn't force us to confront the power of Christ's message and mission. Until we see the cross and the lynching tree together, until we can identify Christ with a re-crucified black body hanging from a lynching tree, there can be no genuine understanding of Christianity in America, and no deliverance from the brutal legacy of slavery and white supremacy. End of quote. The embedded challenge that we face is the evangelical construction of the faith that sees the faith itself separate from social context and the costly grace of Jesus. In traditional terms, Christian theology has sought to locate notions of reconciliation in the restorative work of Jesus' passion and subsequent death on the cross. It has seen the sinful nature of humankind that led to the grief between the holiness of God and the fallen state in which human beings exist, as our first speaker done this morning, through the lens of this wonderful hymn, which I still sing. All of us are in need of grace. That is fundamentally true. And Jesus' death on the cross is that which serves as the link between a holy God and sinful humanity. And so one can trace a trajectory from the Apostle Paul through to St. Anselm and then to Martin Luther for the development of a form of atonement theory in which the central formula for effecting reconciliation is Jesus' saving work on the cross. Paul's writings, which form the earliest documented text in the New Testament canon, are replete with references to God's reconciling work in Christ on the cross. And one can point to such texts as Romans 5:10, 1 Corinthians 5:14 to 21, 2 Corinthians 5:18 to 20, Colossians 1:18 to 23. For Paul, love of God in Christ demonstrated on the cross not only reconciles us to God, but that love transmitted through the transforming work of the Holy Spirit reconciles us to one another. In the classic imagery of Christian theology, reconciliation and the purpose of God is represented in the shape of the cross. As the vertical axis represents the reconciliation between God and human beings, and the horizontal one between human beings and one another. But here's the rub. The nature of Paul's spiritualization of the salvific work of Jesus finds expression in his, well, it's intentional or not, scholars argue about this, in downplaying of the physical in favour of the spiritual. Paul's injunctions against the weakness of the flesh, i.e. this for diminution in the importance of the incarnation of Jesus' physical reality as an oppressed Jew. So the downplaying of the contextual nature of Jesus' person, a first century colonized Jew, in favour of his spiritual reality, enables the Jesus of history to become this universal salvific Christ, whose death saves all people for all time. By downplaying the body and the incarnation, Paul creates opportunities for later followers of Christ to punish and persecute the body of black people, saving the knowledge that it is their souls that ultimately matter, not their bodies. After all, if Jesus' own body is of limited importance, then the bodies of black folk are largely irrelevant in terms of how humanity is construed. It's why when we have thought about John Newton, and I have to say that in the lecture this morning, fantastic lecture, the bit that made me most pleased is when the speaker, Professor Heinrich, spoke about the agency and the activism of enslaved people themselves and gave voice to what is often overlooked. As I said, that when we think about John Newton's conversion and the writing of this powerful hymn, we barely give thought to people he shaped. We barely give thought to people who have just become a small detail in history, as if somehow they don't matter. Well, black liberation theology says they matter, and they matter more so. Not because they're more important than that of white privilege, but they matter precisely because history has consigned them to oblivion. In his 50-plus years as a public intellectual, James Cone was concerned consistently with the need for the church to live out her mandate to be a lived and practiced experiment in the liberationist expression of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Perhaps the most consistent and sustained critique of the failure to be the church can be found in a chapter in his 1986 book, Speaking the Truth. In chapter 4, he writes a theological challenge to the American church. Cohn offers a coherent critique of American Christianity that acts as a case study for his assessment of the way in which Christianity has been bound into the body politic of America. And Cohn makes it clear that he could write a similar critique of any particular aspects of white American Christianity. Imagine in 1986 he said, particularly of the Catholic Church, he says the Catholic hierarchy in the United States is exclusively controlled by whites. Many black Catholics, therefore, find it difficult to challenge structures of authority in the church with enormous limitations being placed on their ministry. This chapter offers an important basis to the landmark article he did at the Journal for IA 16 years later, where he outlines the nature of white institutional myopia in the witnessing of white supremacy. His evaluation of what purports to be real in light of human experience is important because theology is human speech about God. God does not do theology. Theology is done by people, by human beings, influenced by their history and culture and social interest. This may sound like an elementary point, but when blacks read the textbooks of white theologians, that we often find that what is written is purports to be universal but has very little to do with our lived experience. In my own context, I remember one of the last national, in Methodism, actually we call it connection meetings I went to, which was a gathering in 2006. It was the summer of 2006. I remember there was a gathering of Methodist theologians who had come together to discuss the forthcoming 2007 Oxford Institute for Methodist Theological Studies. During the gathering of the participants, of which I was the only black member, all of us were asked to think about what were the historical landmarks to which the Institute should mark and respond in the following year, 2007. In a lengthy conversation, my white Methodist colleagues managed to name every obscure and not so obscure anniversary, except for the dominant one on which my black mind and body was focused, namely the bicentenary abolition of the slave trade in Britain and their dominions. Not one white person mentioned the forthcoming commemoration and its huge significance for Methodists, given that I found that John Wesley's last major statement prior to his death in 1791 was a letter to Wilberforce, exhorting him to continue in his pronouncements against the evils of slavery. So the failure of that meeting to not only to note their whiteness, that I was the only black person in the meeting, but how the experience of being white was so normative that it had completely shaped their consciousness. And for me that was so powerful and nauseating that I decided then and then I would never frequent another Methodist theological gathering of that sort. And at the time of writing, I have not come back to another meeting. Cohn's critique of white Christianity, therefore, is enshrining the failures of the institutional white church, not saying every white person by any means, absolutely not, to be attentive to the concerns of the things that were uppermost in Jesus' own ministry, care for the poor, the marginalised and the neglected, should see all churches adopting a liberationist stance in terms of their relationship to power and vested self-interest. Most crucially, it should entail a severe critique of and action to denounce white supremacy, as the latter is a clear denial of the gospel. And yet the absence of a critique at best and downright collusion at worst with the active and most veiled workings of white supremacy have continued to besmirch the legitimacy of the church in the global north. It's worth noting that in the many years post-1994 change, when the English generation first came, there was a period in which a number of Anglican dioceses were in the business of encouraging their black members, communicant members of hundreds of years of the Church of England, to leave and to go join Pentecostal churches because they would be more at home amongst their own kind. Therefore, it's important as we think about British history, the rise of black-led Pentecostalism, for example, is to see that part of their existence, not their sole existence, but part of their existence, is a consequence of the hypocrisy of white British Christianity that's often preferred to worship whiteness and its accompanying forms of entitlement and notions of superiority than worship its Saviour who lived his life and died as a colonised and oppressed Galilean Jew. So several centuries of white theological escapism has rendered the Christian gospel as one that is friendly to colonialism and empire. Whilst Korn's earlier books explored the wider Christian tradition in order to explicate the necessity for liberation to be seen as a theological norm underpinning Christian theology, his 2011 book, The Cross and the Lynching creates a microcosm around the cross as its primary focus for re-articulating the central features of black liberation theology. Speaking of his intellectual journey from that first book, Black Theology and Black Power, in 1969, through to The Cross and the Lynching Tree in 2011, Korn writes, and I quote, "All of my work since that first book has involved an effort to relate the gospel to the black experience, the experience of oppression, as well as the struggle to find liberation and meaning. Inevitably, it has led to these reflections on the cross and the lynching tree, the essential symbol of Christianity and the quintessential emblem of black suffering." Korn continues to challenge the theological pietism by resolutely linking the spiritual and the theological to the socio-political and ethical. Korn makes it clear that unless one is willing to face the grisly connotations of the cross with its links to imperialism and greed and oppression, and then juxtapose that with the suffering and exploitation of those on the obverse side of this, then one will never understand the true power and the significance of the cross. In fact, the charge of cheap grace that was thrown at comfortable white middle-class Christians from the epoch of Soren Kierkegaard and later Dietrich Bonhoeffer into the present day still rings true. Korn identifies Martin Luther King's commitment to racial justice as analogous to that of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his identification with suffering Jewish people in Germany, both of whom paid the ultimate price for having the courage to live out their convictions, to carry the cross of Christ in solidarity with others, having denied themselves the luxury of contentment by doing so. For Korn, authentic discipleship is nothing less than the denial of self and carrying the cross in solidarity with others. Matthew 16:24, Luke 9:23. This challenge is aimed primarily at white people. We see God's revelation not in abstract terms, but rather in the lived experience of black suffering, marginalisation and oppression. It is to be committed to the denial of white privilege and to see the cross as a mark of a kind of solidarity that joins forces with God in Christ, and standing alongside all those who are crucified at the behest of untrammeled power and oppressive forces. I need the last word in the mouths of one of Korn's great heroes, and one of my heroes, which is the great social prophet James Baldwin, who writes this: "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." Thank you.
Well, we have about 15 minutes, I think, for questions for Professor Reddie, so the floor is open for those questions.
Thanks, Professor Reddie, for your illuminating lecture in so many different ways of grounding us within Black liberation theology. I guess as a scholar of blues and jazz music, and you referenced Mahalia Jackson, and I see very much blues and jazz as on the continuum in terms of gospel and the spirituals. I want to lay the cross down for a moment and refer to the crossroads I wonder whether I might invite you to meditate on the crossroads as a motif within Black liberation theology, and maybe the crossroads for us to be thinking about as we approach the crossroads as a turning point, both that links Newton and the Africans and literally the Atlantic, and the notion of, yes, the intersection crossroads.
Well, thankfully, I can honestly say that these words are not my words. I mean, I'm clever, but I'm not that clever. In that 72, James Conrad was called the spirituals and the blues. And in that 72, and it's a very quick background. So if you read Conrad, although he's very much steeped in the Black liberation tradition, he's a very traditional systematic theologian. So if you read his early books, a lot of these interlocutors are kind of white German scholars, you know, so high scholasticism, you know, it's a head intellectual studies. Good writing, it's hard to follow. So nothing like sibling rivalry. So his older brother, called Cecil, who was always kind of in James' shadow, but the older brother, so bear that in mind. They're not scorching actors to say, well, James Connor's not really a black theologian. He's only black in so far as his skin is black, and he talks about black history. But his theological method, his sources are all white European. So you can imagine how that goes down with James Connor. It's like, okay, you know, and it's like, okay, so my older brother just slapped me down now. So what he does is, he then goes into African American Christian tradition and looks at the spirituals and the blues. And essentially what he says is, there are two sides of the same coin. So the blues is Saturday night, that is living in the world with existential despair. And you know, and just singing out your woes. The spirituals, it says, is what the same people sing on a Sunday morning. Trying to sanctify and trying to find theological sustenance in order to speak to the realities of Saturday night and the rest of the week. And that is a dialectical tension, he says, that is never fully resolved. And it seems to me that part of the challenge we have when we sing Amazing Grace actually is that same sort of dialectical challenge, because on the one hand, it is a hymn that comes out of white privilege. As I said, he's a guy who repents, and I know some people I know some black scholars are not particularly happy with Newton, and they're not convinced about his conversion. I'll be honest with you, I've never been that bothered about it, because like I said, I'm bothered about the people we don't talk about, they're enslaved Africa. So there's a sense in which the song has a tension, because on the one hand, it comes out of a particular context that is problematic to think about. And yet at the same time, the words and the way which has been taken up of the transcend its provenance. And part of the difficulty, I think, sometimes, certainly if I think back to 2007, I remember giving a talk to the Newton Society that did not go down as well as this one. Different times. Was at that time, it seemed to me that what we wanted to do was to talk about Newton in a very unproblematic way, as if there was no issue about his life. Yes, he converts, but what's he convert for? And all the years he was involved in that, what did that do? Not just to him, but to the people he transported, that we didn't want to talk about. That is still an issue, but of course that does not detract from the power of the song, or the hymn, shall I say, does not detract from the power of the hymn, but I think it reminds us that there is, as you said, a crossroads, there is a tension there. And for me, I think what's most redemptive about Newton's story is that he made a choice. He made a choice and made a decision at a crossroads in terms of taking a new direction. And that for me is a powerful narrative for a country that still doesn't want to talk about empire. And it's interesting that even under the aegis of not the present, but like two educational secretaries back, it was like, well, let's teach people about Wilberforce, let's teach people about abolition. That's fine, but here's the thing, how do you teach about abolition if you're not going to talk about the things that abolition was trying to overthrow, which was the slavery itself? If you don't tell the story of slavery, then abolition makes no sense. Yet for many white historians, well, let's talk about the good things that the British Navy did. Yes, that the British Navy did police the waters in the years post-1807 to stop other people from shipping slaves. That is great. But unless you then talk about there were ships called Jesus in the previous years that enslaved people, that later conversation makes no sense whatsoever. And therefore, to talk about crossroads is to talk about, as Baldwin says, that until we face up to the history, in its myriad complexities, British history is complex. It's not simple black and white. They're not just villains and heroes. Always have been so clear. But sort of what we have is almost a literal whitewashing of history that wants to take out all those sanitary bits that we don't want to talk about. So the student at school, I learned all about the Industrial Revolution. What I was never taught was where did the capital come from in order to do all those innovations? It came from enslavement. And it came from the profits that were being made by British industrialists, shipping black bodies of people who were my ancestors.
Thank you. Another question here.
Reading on what you just mentioned, oh no.
Yeah? Oh, wow, okay. I can't remember what I was going to say now. Reading on what you were just talking about in terms of education and mentioning George Floyd and thinking about society today and the generation that's going to be our future leaders, potentially two that could be here. I was just wondering how we educate young people about exactly what you said. How we educate young people about colonialism, that the British Empire and Commonwealth and the interchangeable language that is, and where we are today and how it affects young people now.
I think the first thing I have to say as an academic who believes in academic rigor is I'm not for propaganda, so I'm not wanting to say to our children, young people, let me give you a version of history that is one tone and not yours. That is never good education. I think good education gives our students critical skills to make determinations for themselves. And therefore, a good form of teaching history, in terms of broad terms of education, is always to show that there is always contestation. So, for example, one example I often give certain terms of this aspect of history, that in 1787, I believe, that I could be wrong, but I think when Wilberforce brought his first bill to Parliament to try and end slavery, it was resolutely defeated. And such was the thought at the time of the way in which slavery was embedded into the normalisation of British society, that many people saw this as a sign of God's approval. So in Bristol, for example, in the parish church at Legacies, they rang the bell to celebrate the fact that clearly God was in favour of slavery, because if God who wants slavery to be ended, then Parliament would have voted in favour. Now when I teach that to students, I'm not teaching to students in order to make them feel embarrassed. I'm teaching to students to say, part of the difficulty of us standing here in our 20th century gap, or 21st century gap, should I say, is the difficulty of trying to get into the thought processes of the time when, for a lot of people, slavery was as normal as going to the butcher's and ordering a pork chop to eat meat. It's just what you did. So part of good education is not just to demonise slavery as being evil, clearly it was, but it's to say, but what was it about its institution that was so normalised that most good people could see? And therefore, one of the things I often say is that in our present epoch, there are things that are probably built into our way of living that we have not entirely resolved, that we are wrestling with. That maybe at some point in the future, 200 years' time, people will look at us and say, but how on earth could those people in the 20th century have done that? And so, for example, I'll stop sharing this with Martin, so I've Martin, so I've put this, like you've heard of this before, over the meal. But both of us have a mutual friend who's very much, is a Christian theologian who is into animal rights, and is a vegetarian, and his basic view is Christians should not be eating animals. Simply unethical, it's simply wrong. That is still a contested argument. Increasingly more young people are turning to vegetarianism, veganism than perhaps maybe in my generation. I'm certain if I go to my parents and I say, Mum and Dad, I do not want to eat meat anymore, like, they'll look at me like I was crazy. It's like, what? Are you mad? And of course I have to turn to the Bible and try to justify it, because we all know that if you turn to the Bible, you can always justify anything. If you turn to the Bible, find an obscure text. Probably said with climate justice, that we are still contesting that, even though the evidence in front of us, let's say, on Monday and Tuesday, we have warnings to say that it will be hotter than it's ever been in the history of this country, and maybe people should not go to school, maybe we should cancel work, maybe we should think about what we're doing, because clearly the climate change. And yet there are many people who, some will say it doesn't exist. But most of us are kind of, if we're honest, as of benign lazy people. It's like we know it exists, but we're not going to make any real change at this moment in our lifestyle, because we just can't be bothered. That is the equivalent now of what slavery was like in certainly up until the latter part of the 18th century. So therefore I think good education did not be about propaganda, it's simply helping people to say, how do we think critically about the ethical choices we have to make, acknowledging that sometimes it's the grey areas that we can't see clearly in front of us, that others will look at us later and will judge us. So where we habitually judge people in the 18th and 19th century, so when I teach students and look at this, they'll look at me aghast and say, how could people ever thought slavery was okay? And it's like, well, actually, that's part of what I'm trying to get you to wrestle with, because it seems abhorrent to us now, but it was normal practice. It was normal practice in the latter part of the Georgian era. Sorry, big word.
Time for one last question, I think, before the break.
Thank you, Professor, for your amazing speech. The question is, and it's going to sound roundabout, it's really good that we referenced King David this morning. I think that lots of people can possibly identify with Bathsheba, and the fact that we make rape victims pray the Psalms, and Psalms are attributed to a rapist, and it doesn't matter that he's not their abuser, because he is an abuser. And I wonder if you could speak to that same kind of phenomenon for the black community having to sing a song written by someone who oppresses them.
I mean, there's, I think, two different things going on there, so I'll tell the second one first very quickly. I think for a lot of black people, they probably don't know much about Newton in terms of him being the author. And if they did, I think someone would say, but when we're singing it, we have found a transcendent moment in that song that has long since eclipsed its problematic authorship and providence. I don't want to speak for everyone around that, but I think for a lot of people, I think that's the case. I mean, I remember when I first was doing some study on this, and then if in doubt, I was always really by my parents, that they were always like my fiercest critics. I mean, it's like they loved their son, but they were not particularly taking anything I've ever made. I mean, that's just it's a liberal left-wing nonsense. I mean, I don't know where you got it from, but you didn't get it from us, so I would kind of run it by you. And my mum would say, well, I mean, I know what you mean, but however, I know that God's grace has saved me and I'm transformed by it. So I think there's a sense of great art could always transcend the problematic nature out of which it comes. And I think there's a kind of generic thing there. So, for example, it's a scientific thing, but I remember doing English literature and loving the work of, what's his name now? So the poet was called University. Philip Larkin. And the letter comes out, Larkin's a horrible racist. Not that, if you read his words in his memoirs, in his private journal, he's a horrific guy. But yet his poetry is still brilliant. I can still read his poetry because I don't have to think about Larkin when I read it, because his words are fantastic. So I think there's something about art that can transcend, but I want to be careful about not extending that out absolutely, because there are other bits of art that is deeply problematic. And also, to be honest, like we make kind of political judgments on what we think is transcendent and what isn't. So, so Wagner was a horrible German Nazi, but we still listen to his music. Gary Glitter was an abuser, but we don't play his music at all, quite frankly. As I also think it's crap. So therefore, there's also the element of class as well as to what transcends and what doesn't. In terms of the first bit, that is a much harder question, and I think one of the things I love about liberation theologies is this notion of this hermeneutical suspicion, which simply means that when you read texts, you ask yourself the question, who benefits, whose worldview is benefited from me reading this and taking it literally, or not, as the case may be. And you're right, there is something about the way in which we sometimes read, particularly within the Hebrew Bible, texts that are texts of terror. There's a very famous book written by a woman called Phyllis Trible called Texts of Terror, where she says, if you're a woman, there are some texts you just want to stand away from because, quite frankly, that does not give you a picture of God that will be redeeming for you. And therefore, one of the permissions I sometimes give, but not that for me to give permission, but hey, if I've had the powers of a professor to give permission, I give permission to people to say, sometimes just walk away from the text. Sometimes you read it and you say, you know something, I don't fully understand it, I just know that this is problematic for me. And remember that the Bible is not God, the Bible points to God. The Bible is a roadmap to God. The analogy I often use is that the tube map is fantastic to get you around London, but the tube map isn't London. The tube map speaks to and gives you directions to, but it's not the thing itself, and therefore let's not confuse texts written by human beings that are trying to speak and describe God and God's self. God is righteous and liberated, and nothing, and for me, is never anything less than that.
I'm sure this is a conversation that will continue, but for the time being, we thank Professor Reddie again for his